Hey guys, how's it going? Gita here from the Retro Oasis, and today we're gonna do an in-depth review of the Odin Pro. Yeah, I know I have this console in my hands for quite some time, but I decided to take my time to really get to know it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Welcome to the Oasis. As usual, let's start with the specs. The CPU is the Snapdragon 845 with 4 cores running at 2.8 GHz and 4 cores running at 1.8 GHz. The GPU is the Adreno 630 and it's overclocked to almost 900 MHz. 8 GB of RAM and 128 GB of internal storage, and it has a memory card slot. It's got a 5.98-inch IPS LCD touchscreen at 1080p resolution with the 16:9 aspect ratio, built-in microphone, 2 stereo speakers, and an active cooler. A big 6000 mAh battery that lasts from 5 to 10 hours of gameplay depending on what you're playing. For connectivity, we have Bluetooth, dual-band Wi-Fi, and micro HDMI out. All this is running on Android 10, but you can also install Windows on it. The Odin Pro costs $280 on Indiegogo right now, and I'll leave the link in the description. It's not an affiliated link, but that might change in the future. Let's do a quick tour of the device. We have the 2 analog sticks here, which are asymmetrical, just like the Xbox controller. Up here is the microphone, D-pad, down here the Odin logo that sure resembles Wolverine. Here at the top right, the home button, A, B, X, Y, and select and start buttons. On the top we have the 4 shoulder buttons, and from left to right we have this compartment that holds the micro HDMI output and the memory card slot, an exhaust vent, the volume buttons, an LED indicator light, and the power button. On the bottom we have the 2 stereo speakers, a headphone jack, a USB Type-C port for charging, connect to the Super Dock, and you also have 4K 60 frames per second video output here. Nothing on the left, nothing on the right, just the LED lights here. On the back we have 2 extra programmable buttons, M1 and M2, plus 2 exhaust vents and an air intake vent here. The console's active cooling sucks air through this inlet here and out through these 2 and on top. The thumbsticks are a little smaller than what we used to, with 13.2mm. These thumbsticks are very popular amongst Chinese handhelds and commonly used by Anbernic and Powkiddy. It measures 14.6mm. It's a small difference, but if you're used to these, which are also used on the Nintendo Switch, you'll find it a little strange at first. In the same category, we have the GPD-XP with a much larger analog with 16.7mm. The Powkiddy X18S is slightly smaller with 13.4mm. In general, they're very soft, but they make a little more noise than usual, as you can hear here. The good thing is that they are recessed, like on Anbernic consoles. And that's an advantage if you want to carry it in your pocket. But you need a relatively large pocket to fit this. Oh, and they're clickable. You get L3 and R3 function, making this console a great choice for streaming. A cool detail is that under these analog rings there are LED lights, and they make the console very premium. Unfortunately, these lights aren't RGB. You can't adjust the color or intensity. But regardless, I thought it was awesome and made it look more like a gamer device. The D-pad really shines here. It is identical to the PS Vita and the GPD-XP, but its movement is smoother and reminds me more of the PS Vita. It's lower on the Vita, but when you press it, it stays almost in the same level of the body. On the Odin is a little more raised, and when you press it, it rests slightly above it. On the GPD-XP, is way above the console's casing. When pressed, it barely moves, with a very short travel distance. You get more resistance here. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's still great on the GPD-XP, but on Odin is definitely much softer with a very good pivot and medium travel distance. Amongst these three consoles, Odin's the best in my opinion. The A, B, X and Y buttons measure 7.5mm, which is a hair smaller than the Embernic RG552 with 7.6mm. The GPD-XP has even smaller buttons with 6.6mm. The ones on the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus measure 6.9mm. So 7.5mm is on par with most handheld consoles we know. They are firm and have a medium to long travel distance. When pressed, they rest slightly above the level of the body. My only complaint is that they are a little noisy. It's not the best option to play in bed if you have someone sleeping next to you. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it through the camera, the letters are glossy and printed on the button itself. Going to the L1 and R1, they are clicky, but they have a rubber membrane underneath and are not as noisy as clicky buttons normally are. Actually, some people had problems with these buttons, but Aang was very quick to fix it and will soon start to send the upgrade kits to fix the issue. Apparently, this kit is very simple and once these buttons are changed, the problem is solved. And from now on, all new units are already being shipped problem-free. And like most click buttons, they have a very short travel for quick response. L2 and R2 are another positive for the Odin. They are analog, which is great for racing games and even certain emulators like Dolphin for GameCube. The travel distance is not as long as most analog triggers, and in racing games, as I mentioned, car acceleration occurs according to the pressure you put on the button. Very good for xCloud. The M1 and M2 buttons here in the back are clicky and very similar to L1 and R1, with that rubber membrane underneath them. Also very short travel distance here, and at the moment it can only be mapped for Android games. But this week Aang is releasing the first software update, and one of the added features is the possibility to map these back buttons in other apps as well, such as RetroArch or Dolphin, making everybody's life a lot easier. As for the build quality, I have nothing to complain about. It is great considering that this is Aang's first device. Everything fits perfectly with no edges or gaps. They use a sturdy plastic, making the console very firm and solid. It feels like a handheld that can handle quite a beating. I like the fact that they use a plastic that's matte rather than glossy. It helps to hide fingerprints. But if you look carefully, you can still see them. But that's the way it is. This is an issue that plagues most handheld consoles. Talking about ergonomics, I can say that the Odin is the most comfortable handheld console I currently have. It just fits in your hand very naturally. These contours on the back of the housing make for a very comfortable grip, and your middle fingers rest perfectly on top of the back buttons, just as your index fingers rest on top of the shoulder buttons. And since the thumbstick is a little smaller and recessed, I have no problems bumping into it when I press the facing buttons on the front here. This is a problem I constantly have when using the GPD-XP. Since I have ridiculously big fingers, my thumb always bumps into the right analog stick when I need to press the A button. I don't have to worry about this with the Odin. Overall, Aang hit the bullseye with the design of this device. As for the size, the Odin is 9 cm and a half tall, 22.5 cm long, and an average of 2.5 centimeters thick at the thickest part of the console. Here we have it side by side with the Nintendo Switch OLED. Here next to the GPD-XP. Next to the Embernic RG552 with the PS Vita. Next to the Palkidi X18S, which has pretty much the same dimensions as the Nintendo 3DS X Large. And finally, next to the Embernic RG351P. As for the weight, the Odin Pro has 366 grams. Despite being smaller, the RG552 is quite heavy with 357 grams, only 8 grams lighter. The funny thing is that although the difference in weight is not huge, the RG552 definitely feels heavier. On the Odin, the weight is better balanced, and you don't even feel it. The GPD-XP weighs 375 grams, only 10 grams heavier, and just like the RG552, you feel the weight a little more here, especially in these grips. The Palkitty X18S weighs 308 grams. The Nintendo Switch OLED is bigger and heavier with 425 grams, but just like the Odin, it also has the weight well balanced. Definitely, with the material used on this device, the size and the ergonomics, you won't even feel these 366 grams. It takes about 23 seconds to fully boot the Odin, and that's on par with other handheld consoles running Android. The interface is basically like any other Android device or cell phone. The good thing is that you can navigate using the D-pad for almost everything. By dragging from top to bottom at the top of this screen, you have a quick menu where you can activate Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, airplane mode. This icon here you can activate the performance modes, overclocking the GPU. This is very important when playing more demanding games and heavier emulators like GameCube or PlayStation 2. By default, it comes with standard mode on. Clicking once goes to performance mode, and once again goes to high performance mode. And in each mode, the fan kicks in a different speed. This one activates the LED lights, but it just turns on and off. You can also choose only the ones on the analog sticks or only the ones on the sides of the console. But for that, you need to go into the settings. And the last icon here is to enable the Do Not Disturb mode. You can still drag from top to bottom once more and reveal more options like hotspot, take screenshot, activate the cooler, among other things. If you go to the settings, we can go all the way down to Odin settings. Here you can activate the LED lights individually as I mentioned earlier, only the thumbsticks or just the sides. We also have other interesting options like the video output, where you can choose to send the signal through the micro HDMI port at 1080p or through the USB Type-C at 4K 60 frames per second. You can adjust audio settings, show your network speed, and we have this option here that I think is awesome. In fact, this option is also present on the Palkitty X18S. You can adjust the default scheme for the face buttons. Xbox, which is what I personally prefer, with the A here and the B here, the X here and the Y here, or the Odin pattern, the same used by Nintendo. You can also change the triggers to analog only, digital only, or both. You can calibrate controls, adjust the dead zone, test the buttons, and more. Okay, I already have my console all set up with all the emulators I use downloaded and some Android games. The Odin already comes with its own front end installed. It's not as good looking as Dig or Launchbox, but it's packed with options. Basically, you can add the application you want to use by clicking the plus sign here. Once you're done, just click the X to close. Here you can customize a number of things. If you click and hold on the icon for a few seconds, you have some options like uninstalling the app, repositioning, changing the background color, etc. Down here, you can also go straight to the Odin settings, same ones we visited earlier. You can change the layout and change the wallpaper. Dragging from left to right in the left corner of the screen is a menu where you can adjust the performance modes. The lights on the sides and analog sticks. You can select the category of applications you want to view. You can change the mode from dark to light and vice versa. And we have a quit button to exit the launcher. Doing the same thing on the other side, dragging from right to left, we have more options here. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and airplane mode. We can adjust the brightness, view storage information, video output options, enter standby mode, and see the temperature of the console and the amount of RAM memory available. There's really no lack of options in this launcher. And even though I have Launchbox as my main front end, if you don't want to pay or you don't want to go over the trouble of setting it up, this Odin launcher is great. But what about the display? Let's do some comparisons, and I'm gonna use the Palkitty X18S and the Embernic RG552. The 552 actually has one of the best screens I've ever found on a handheld console so far. For this test, all screens are at 100% brightness. Talking about brightness, the X18S has the darkest screen of the three. Here it is with the Odin, and here with the 552. The Odin in this case has the brightest screen of them all, here with the 552. In terms of colors, the RG552 wins. They are more vivid and saturated, as we can see here on the arrow and in the green of the trees. The X18S does have nice colors, but with such low brightness it's hard to compare. As for the viewing angle, the X18S is once again in last place. The screen goes dark quickly and the colors distort. The Odin and the 552 are side by side, with the Odin coming out a little ahead for having more brightness. Now let's compare the quality of the pixels. And for that, we're going to use our trusty Super Nintendo's Mega Man X. On the X18, we can see right away that the pixels on the energy bar are far from perfect. We can clearly see they're not symmetrical. This can be easily fixed by turning on the integer scale. But when we do that, we lose almost half a centimeter up and down in our playing area. On the 552 and Odin, without changing anything in the settings, the pixels are pretty much perfect. If you look very carefully, you will notice that the spacing is not 100% symmetrical between all the bars. Honestly, for most people, these two devices here are great. You need a clinical eye to notice these differences, and with these two consoles here, you can start and play with virtually perfect pixels. But for the purists that really want perfect pixels, let's turn the integer scale on both consoles. This is where the 552 comes out ahead. We lost 1 mm on top and bottom of the screen, practically nothing. And now we have 100% nice square perfect pixels. On the Odin we lost about 6 mm at the top and bottom, total of 1.2 cm, which is a considerable amount of play area. Even the X18S has a slightly larger area than the Odin with the integer scale on. But as I said, few people have such a clinical eye. I'm very picky about my perfect pixels, and I would happily play full screen on the Odin, because the difference is minimal. In the end, in my opinion, first is the RG552, which remains the best screen on a portable console, then the Odin, and finally the X18S. Now let's jump to audio. The Odin at maximum volume can reach up to 95.2 decibels. The Valkyrie X18S reaches 98.6, and the Embernic 552 goes up to 93. As you could see from the tests, the 552 have the lowest volume of the three, but that doesn't mean anything, cause it still has great sound. The Valkyrie X18S is the loudest of the three, great quality and very good bass. So in terms of volume loudness, the Odin is right in the middle, but I still think it has the best sound of the three. It's got awesome bass and details, and you can clearly hear both audio channels. Now before I start testing some games, let's have a look at the benchmark. For this test I'm using Geekbench 5. The Odin scores 523 on a single core and 2222 in multi-core. The Valkyrie 18S scores 343 single core and 1275 multi-core. So the Odin is almost double the score. And the RG552 250 single core and 710 multi-core. So yeah, the Odin is definitely much more powerful, and that will reflect directly on the emulators and games. Now let's test some games. Starting with native Android games, the Odin is powerful enough to play anything in the market today. 8, 16 and 32 systems will run without issues here. Since GBA has 3:2 aspect ratio, that is a bit more widescreen, the games look really nice on this display. Nintendo DS plays really well, even if with the high-resolution 3D rendering on. Running 3DS games has always been a bit complicated. You'll have a few hiccups here and there, but you can still play a few titles. It's good to remember that Citra builds cache for the games. You can have a few freezes when you start a game, but some of them will be gone when you run the game a second time. Even hard to emulate Nintendo 64 games, like Cruising Exotica, will run nicely at 1080p. PSOne is another one, 1080p all the way. Sega Saturn, 1080p, check. Dreamcast, to me, was a system that was ahead of its time. As you can probably guess, 1080p. You'll be able to play a lot of Wii and GameCube games on the Odin. Of course, not all of them will run perfectly, but you can play the majority of them.
Don't be thinking you can beat me. Take this! Ha! Somebody, tell Craig!
The Odin is the true portable PS2. Several games will run really well on this device, and some of them even at 1080p. And you'll even be able to play some Nintendo Switch games on the Odin. Of course, most of them are 2D and not too demanding. Here I'm using the SNES emulator and the GameSir X2. I have a video on this channel testing the performance of only Nintendo Switch games on the Odin. Another cool thing to do here is remote play from your PlayStation 4 or PS5. It won't work on the official PlayStation app because it doesn't support the Odin controls. Here I'm using the PS Play, which is a paid app, but it works really well. And you can also play your Xbox games, streaming directly from your Xbox or via xCloud. So Sony's Remote Play, Xbox Streaming and xCloud will work fine with the Odin. And the verdict: the Odin Pro is by far one of the best handheld consoles with Android on the market today. It has a nearly 6-inch screen with great brightness and excellent viewing angles. It has a reasonable size, not being overly large, and at the same time not so small where you would have to sacrifice the screen size. It has the horizontal orientation that is very popular and preferred by most people, excellent and responsive controls, and super comfortable ergonomics where you'll be able to play for hours without getting tired. Not to mention the great battery life that will ensure that this happens without problems. The software is mature and simple, with no bloatware or unnecessary apps installed. And it has a nice front end that, despite being simple, is full of options. Another plus point is the Super Dock. It is an extra accessory that's not mandatory but adds a ton of features to the console. You can use controllers through the USB ports. It has an additional Nintendo 64 and GameCube controller ports, a SATA HD or SSD slot. In short, you can turn your Odin into a complete tabletop console. I have a dedicated video about the Super Dock here on the channel, and I'll leave the link in the description for anyone interested. And I don't even need to mention the performance, which is the best for an Android handheld console these days. At the price, which despite not being affordable for many people, it is a bargain for what it offers. It is important to mention the problems with the L1 and R1 buttons, which actually aren't that big of a problem because it's already being rectified. In addition, the manufacturer is concerned with improving the user experience, releasing the first over-the-air update on the device this week, adding a bunch of improvements, and you don't need to stress over the update. Just go to your device's settings and update from there. If I could change anything on the Odin, would be to increase the size of the analog sticks just a little bit and add Android navigation buttons like back and multitasking, maybe down here where the logo is. Well, no handheld console is perfect, but the Odin comes pretty close. In fact, one of the Odin's biggest problems is how hard it is to get one now. Currently, you can buy it through Indiegogo, but there is a very long queue. Once all Indiegogo orders have been fulfilled, AIM will move into the next phase of production by starting to sell the handheld on their official website. Matter of fact, it is already on preview. But if you don't want to wait, there are other options. The Palkitty X18S that I've shown several times in the video is good value for money with great performance for its price. It leaves something to be desired in some aspects, such as screen brightness, a strange and somewhat uncomfortable grip, and a very bad D-pad. Oh, and the lack of L3 and R3 buttons. Another option would be the Embernic RG552. It has a fantastic screen, far better controls, ergonomics, and build quality than the X18S, but it compromises on some features such as the lack of dual-band Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Performance will also be lower for a slightly higher price. The last option I'd like to add is the GPD XP. It was my main handheld console before Odin. It has modular controls, an excellent display, although the aspect ratio is a bit strange for a handheld console. It has a SIM card slot, front camera, and a phenomenal battery life. It also performs better than the X18 and the RG552, but it is the most expensive console mentioned in this video. I know that was a long one, but I wanted to get every single detail of the Odin Pro. And if you made it to the end, consider leaving a like before you go and subscribing for more videos like this one. Once again, Gilly here from the Retro Oasis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.